In 1969, the world looked up, not at a rocket, not at a satellite, but at something that in many ways changed the course of human civilization just as dramatically. A machine so enormous, so impossibly graceful, that the engineers who built it weren't entirely sure it would actually fly. It had 4 engines, a double-deck cabin, and a hump on its nose that would become one of the most recognizable silhouettes in aviation history. This was the Boeing 747. And today, we're going back to the very beginning, to the boardrooms, the drawing tables, the test runways, and the roaring ambition of the people who dared to build the queen of the skies. 4 of them hung beneath those iconic swept wings, and together they could generate enough force to launch the aircraft, fully loaded, to cruising altitudes of 35,000 feet and beyond. What made the JT-9D revolutionary wasn't just its power, it was its efficiency. Turbofan engines work by surrounding a central jet core with a massive fan. To understand why the 747 was born, you have to understand the world of the early 1960s. Air travel was booming, but it was also exclusive. A transatlantic ticket could cost the equivalent of 2 months' salary for an average American worker. Flying was for diplomats, executives, and the wealthy. Ordinary families simply could not afford it. At the same time, airports were becoming bottlenecks. More planes meant more congestion, more delays, more overcrowded terminals, more chaos on the tarmac. The aviation industry faced a fundamental question. How do you move more people faster without just multiplying the number of aircraft? The answer, it turned out, was to go bigger, much bigger. In 1965, Pan American World Airways, Pan AM, was the most powerful airline on Earth. Its president, Juan Trippe, was a visionary who believed that if you could dramatically lower the cost per seat, you could democratize air travel. You could put ordinary people in the sky. Trippe went to his old friend Bill Allen, the CEO of Boeing, with a challenge. He wanted an aircraft twice the size of anything flying at the time. Allen, by most accounts, paused, took a breath, and said yes. That handshake between 2 men would change the world. Boeing didn't just build the 747. Boeing bet the company on it. The project was led by a brilliant and relentless engineer named Joe Sutter, a man who would later be called the father of the 747. Sutter assembled a team of over 50,000 engineers, designers, and workers across Boeing's facilities in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. But first, they needed a place to build it. The 747 was so large that no existing factory in the world could house it. So Boeing did what Boeing does: they built one. In Everett, Washington, they constructed the largest building by volume on the entire planet, a facility so massive that clouds have been known to form inside it on humid days. That building, known as the Everett factory, still stands today, and it still produces some of Boeing's biggest aircraft. The design process was nothing short of extraordinary. Engineers had to solve problems that had never existed before. How do you evacuate 400 passengers in 90 seconds? How do you pressurize a cabin that wide? How do you build a fuselage that can handle the stresses of thousands of flight cycles without tearing itself apart? One of the most iconic decisions of the entire project was what to do with the upper deck. Originally, Boeing considered making the 747 a full double-decker. But structural engineers pushed back. 2 full decks would make emergency evacuation nearly impossible. The compromise: that legendary raised hump behind the cockpit, creating a small upper lounge and giving the 747 its unmistakable profile. The hump wasn't a compromise. It became a crown. A plane this size needed an engine unlike anything that had come before it. Enter Pratt & Whitney and their JT-9D turbofan engine, the power plant chosen to carry the 747 into the sky. The JT-9D was, at the time, the most powerful commercial jet engine ever built, producing around 43,000 pounds of thrust per engine. That large spinning disc you see at the front of modern jet engines. Most of the thrust actually comes from the bypass air around the core, not from burning fuel. This meant the 747 was far more fuel efficient per passenger than any aircraft that came before it. And those four engines weren't just functional, they were a statement. Four independent power sources meant that even with catastrophic failure, the aircraft retained the ability to fly and land safely. Redundancy was built into its very DNA. Over the decades, the 747 would go on to fly with engines from General Electric and Rolls-Royce as well, each generation more powerful and more efficient than the last. The 747-400, introduced in 1988, featured winglets on its wingtips and next-generation engines that slashed fuel consumption even further, allowing it to fly routes like London to Sydney with only one stop. That wing, 211 feet across, was itself an engineering masterpiece. Swept at 37.5 degrees, it gave the 747 both its high-speed cruise performance and an elegant, almost swan-like appearance in flight. But the 747 wasn't just an engineering achievement. It was a stage. And airlines dressed it accordingly. When Pan Am launched the first commercial 747 service in January 1970, on the route from New York's JFK Airport to London's Heathrow, it wasn't merely a flight. It was an event. Passengers dressed up. There were flowers, there was champagne, and up in that iconic upper deck hump, Pan Am installed a spiral staircase and turned the space into a first-class cocktail lounge. Passengers could leave their seats, climb those stairs, and sip drinks at 35,000 feet while looking out over the clouds. It was, quite simply, the most glamorous thing happening in civilian transportation anywhere on Earth. Other airlines followed with their own interpretations of luxury. In the 1970s and 80s, the upper deck became a piano bar on some carriers. On others, it was converted into a private sleeper suite. Singapore Airlines configured some of their upper decks into intimate first-class cabins with lie-flat beds, years before lie-flat beds were standard anywhere. The sheer width of the main cabin, nearly 20 feet, allowed for a seating configuration of up to 10 across in economy, and still left room for 2 aisles. But in business and first class, that width translated into space that felt genuinely luxurious. Airlines like Lufthansa, British Airways, and Qantas became legendary for their 747 first-class products. The 747 didn't just carry passengers, it carried prestige. The Boeing 747 entered commercial service on January 22, 1970, carried out by Pan Am on Flight 1 from New York to London. It was a moment the aviation world had been building toward for half a decade. And yet, even those who had worked on the program were stunned when they saw it operate for real, the sheer scale of it. The quiet confidence with which it lifted off the runway and climbed into the January sky. Within years, the 747 was flying for nearly every major airline on Earth. By the mid-1970s, T had fundamentally restructured global aviation. Ticket prices on long-haul routes dropped dramatically, in some cases by 50% or more, exactly as Juan Trippe had predicted. Millions of people who had never imagined flying across an ocean were now doing it routinely. The 747 opened up the world. It carried pilgrims to Mecca, tourists to Tokyo, immigrants to new countries, families to reunions. It became the backbone of the air cargo industry too. With its nose-loading freight door, The 747F freighter could swallow entire cars, industrial machinery, and live horses without missing a beat. Over 1,500 747s were eventually built across multiple variants. The -100, the -200, the SB, a shorter, ultra-long-range version. The -300 with its stretched upper deck, and the crown jewel of the classic era. The -400, which became the world's most recognizable long-haul airliner for over 2 decades. In 2023, the last commercial passenger Boeing 747 flight took place, operated by Lufthansa, one of the aircraft's most loyal operators. The Lufthansa passengers on that final flight received commemorative boarding passes, and many of them cried. You don't cry for machines, but the 747 was never just a machine. It was a promise that the sky belonged to everyone. That distance was conquerable, that a family in Ohio could wake up one morning and find themselves in Paris by evening. Joe Sutter, the father of the 747, once said, "The 747 was designed to be the last airplane we'd ever need." He was wrong, of course. Aviation kept evolving. But in many ways, what he really meant was that the 747 was designed to be enough. Enough space, enough power, enough grace. And for half a century it was exactly that. The hump, the 4 engines, the spiral staircase, the champagne at 35,000 feet. The Queen of the Skies didn't just connect cities, she connected people. And that, in the end, is the only legacy that matters. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell, because we're just getting started with aviation history. The story of the Concorde, the A380, and the planes that never made it off the drawing board are all coming up.